If you were born, as I was, sometime during the 20th century, your childhood almost certainly included copious amounts of boredom, of monotony, never-ending stretches of time when you were stuck somewhere, waiting for adults to buy clothes or finish talking to each other, or buckled up in the back seat of a car during an agonizingly long road trip, or perhaps, if you were especially lucky, waiting in line for an hour and a half to ride a roller coaster. Do you remember how excruciating those moments were? I remember sitting in a movie theater once as a kid, waiting for the movie to start, waiting for the previews to start, actually, and feeling so bored I thought I might die. And then, for some reason, it dawned on me that I would likely survive this ordeal and would perhaps even look back on it one day as a rather minor part of my life story. But even this oddly rational thought was powerless against the overwhelming sense that I would be in this chair, waiting for all time. I know you know what I'm talking about. It was a terrible feeling. You probably suffered through it alone a lot of the time. But was there someone in your life, an adult or an older kid perhaps, who, in those moments, suggested playing a game? One that didn't require any special equipment or the ability to move around? A game that could be played right then and there, whether you were buckled into your seats and flying down the interstate or winding through the stanchions at a snail's pace. Games like I Spy or 20 Questions, or that one where you silently keep track of license plates from all 50 states as they pass by, or the one where you try to find all the letters of the alphabet on signs and billboards. Or remember that one where you tried to write a story together but each person only got to contribute one word at a time? If you had a musical family, maybe you sang in rounds or played clapping games. If you had a nerdy family, maybe you quizzed each other on state capitals or bird species. Whatever it was, you were passing the time using nothing but the environment, your memory, and your senses. These days, because we're not kids anymore, and because distraction is so readily available, boredom is not such a threat as it once was. We're starting to become aware of why that's kind of a problem, but that's not what I want to talk about today. I find that as an adult, a similar scenario plays out in my head from time to time, only now I'm playing the part of the whiny child and the resourceful game suggester. I always have a few games on hand should that other brand of dreadful feeling strike, that affliction special to adulthood. What shall we call it? It's that state of mind we sometimes describe with such phrases as, I'm not in a good place right now, or I'm too much in my own head. It's when our thoughts are knocking each other around like billiard balls, rather than unfolding and emerging organically in their own time. For me personally, when I'm in this billiard ball headspace, I could be walking around outside on a beautiful day and it wouldn't matter. It would still feel like I was in a cramped room with a low ceiling. Today, I'm going to tell you about 4 games or activities that I like to engage in when I find myself in such a state. These are things that can be done all by yourself, silently and unbeknownst to anyone around you. In some circles, I suppose they might be called thought experiments, but I prefer to call them games to play inside your head when you want to get out of your head. I'm Ellen Riccio, and this is First Creatures. Okay, so imagine I'm a little friend in your head that runs up to you and says, "Let's play." And even though you're a little grouchy, you say, "Okay, what are we playing?" Okay, I was hoping you'd say that. Here are the rules. Imagine that it's 100 years from now, and you're 100 and whatever you are right now. Don't think about this part too much. Yes, not only are you miraculously still alive, but you're feeling spry and sharp, if a little worn around the edges. Your great-grandchildren are gathered around your rocking chair, begging to hear what life was like in the year of our Lord 2025, or whatever year it is when you're playing this game. Now, you've lived a long and full life at this point, so it's a little hard to reach back so far in your memory with any clarity. But you close your eyes and try to remember what it was like, how it was different, what these little descendants of yours might find interesting. And then you open your eyes, and it's like you're right back there in the middle of it. You can see and hear and smell everything as if you were really there in the year 2025. As you scan your surroundings, everything suddenly strikes you as utterly astonishing, and you begin narrating what you are witnessing aloud, or rather inside your head, to the eager children. You struggle to find the right words to describe the various materials, shapes, and sounds around you. You discover that everything is worth mentioning and describing because the world has changed so dramatically in the last 100 years. These children would likely not recognize half of what you are seeing right now. Or they would think it was weird, or funny, or cool. You find that you have to explain strange customs, like how water was basically free, but everyone bought different water and carried it around with them everywhere they went. Or how people used to keep actual live animals in their houses with them that shredded their furniture and slept in their beds. Or how people wore funny little pants that were cut off anywhere between their knees and their behinds, and these were called shorts. Now, I'll pause here and say that I myself buy different water, keep live animals indoors, and wear shorts. I'm not saying these things are especially weird. But they are kind of weird, right? Life on this planet is and has always been wonderfully strange. It's just that it's quite difficult to see that from up close. This game helps us get a little bit of distance, and it's surprisingly thrilling. Here are a few different angles to help get you started. Perhaps this whole conversation with your great-great-great-grandchildren is taking place on Mars, and they want to know what life was like on planet Earth. Or maybe you're still on Earth, and they want to hear stories about your Aunt Margaret, or your pet dog, or they want to know what New York City was like in those days. Or maybe they want to know what the rules were for pickleball. Sometimes I like to get really weird and tell my imaginary grandchildren about how people used to do this bizarre thing called sneezing, which I would then have to try to explain to the best of my ability, relying heavily on demonstrations, I'm sure. Of course, this would imply that people no longer sneeze in the year 2125. But for the purposes of this game, the future your anecdote implies does not need to be even remotely plausible. In fact, the funny thing about this game is that the more positive your descriptions of what you are witnessing, the more pessimistic the implication for the future, and vice versa. Depending on how things play out over the next 100 years, life as it is today could appear charmingly archaic or surprisingly advanced in retrospect. For example, if you marvel at, or in other words, bother to mention, the incredible speed with which people could communicate with each other from opposite sides of the world, you're basically saying that there's been some kind of major technological setback in the intervening years. But if you report to your great-great-greats that people used to have 3 different email addresses and 5 different social media accounts and a laptop and a tablet and a smartphone and a smartwatch, by calling attention to the clunkiness of what we consider to be normal, you are speaking into a future that is sleek and streamlined. I love this game because it removes the tired moral judgments we normally attach to our version of reality. Suddenly it's not somehow bad to be too positive or too negative about the world. You're free to just look. It reminds me of this quote I love by the poet and potter, M.C. Richards. She says, "It is much more interesting not to say what you do not know. Much more interesting to look than to see what is not there." Within the game, it is of no importance whether you honestly believe that our future is bright or dark. You can even toggle back and forth between those predictions. In fact, I think it's good exercise. You're not taking a stance at this point, or even making an educated guess about where this is all headed. The game is only meant to help you see the world around you. As you play, you'll find that the world as it is today could easily be seen as glorious, flourishing, verdant, diverse, and essentially functioning. And it could just as easily be seen as terribly backwards, soulless, cramped, eerie, and piteous. In fact, you can look at the same exact scene and see either picture. For example, let's take a city park. You're at the park and you're looking around and describing what you see to your great-great-great-grandchildren, and you say, "Our streets used to be paved with this stuff called asphalt, and over time these great big holes would open up in it, and we called them potholes. Also, people used to just throw their trash on the ground." Or, looking at the exact same scene, you say, "There used to be hundreds of different kinds of birds where we lived, and they came and went depending on the time of year. I didn't know all their names, not that that would mean anything to you, but they all sang different songs to each other. You could sometimes see them up close when they were perched on tree branches. Oh yeah, we used to have trees everywhere too, all different kinds. And you could see their little beaks opening and closing, but you would not believe the sound coming out of these little guys. Then the children ask you what these now extinct birds looked like, what they sounded like. And fortunately, since you've been given this gift of being here now, you can actually tell them. And voila, you're outside your head, and you're having a conversation with the world. The second game I like to play sometimes is called the documentary game. It was inspired by a documentary film I watched years ago by the French filmmaker Louis Malle called God's Country. Filmed between 1979 and 1985, it's about a small Minnesota farming town and its inhabitants. I'm not sure exactly why I decided to watch this documentary. It wasn't because I was so invested in the plight of Midwestern farmers, I must admit. The film was part of a DVD box set of documentaries by Louis Malle, sent by my father-in-law. Thanks, Frank. The first one I watched was a 7-part series from 1969 called Phantom India. Malle travels around India and observes various customs and traditions, making very little commentary and mostly letting the viewer draw their own conclusions about what they are seeing. In other words, he's not telling you what to see exactly, but he is deciding what to show you. When I realized that he must have applied this same approach a decade later in the United States, in a town that looked very much like the one I grew up in, I was intrigued. I wouldn't have thought that life in a sleepy town with cookie-cutter houses could be the subject of a documentary. But of course, that was because it was essentially my way of life. And no one realizes just how peculiar their way of life is. Near the beginning of the film, there's a segment on people mowing their lawns, obsessively in the eyes of Mull. There are these shots of a wide, paved road lined with enormous trees and flanked by perfectly edge-trimmed front lawns. Occasionally, a huge, shiny car cruises by. The camera holds still, and you are obliged to just look at this familiar scene, and eventually you start to see what Mull sees: peculiarity. I decided to give this a try in my own neighborhood, not with an Aeroflex 35mm camera, but with my own eyes. Here's how it works. I fix my eyes steadily, not on a particular object, but on my whole field of vision. In other words, I frame the shot. The goal is to keep my eyes trained on this broad whole image, such as it is, to try and see everything in it, and to let it begin to speak to me, as I would let it speak if it were being shown to me by a renowned documentary filmmaker. That's it. That's the whole game. If you play this game, you'll find that it's surprisingly difficult not to let your eyes dart towards the first thing that moves, whether it's squirrels chasing each other up a tree or cars crossing at a distant intersection. But notice that you can actually see all these things without shifting your gaze. Hold the camera still, and it will encompass everything. That said, sometimes it's quite effective to deliberately change the focus to a specific object in the background or foreground. Just make sure to stay with it for a while, long enough for it to begin speaking to you. Oh, and don't forget the audio track. You're recording that too. Listen intently to the nature sounds, city noise, human voices. As you continue to look, everything gradually begins to sparkle with meaning. Viewed from this slight remove, no thing is taken for granted. Everything you see and hear seems to bespeak something else. The immaculate garden bespeaks care. The human voices bespeak friendship. The makeshift memorial bespeaks love. The longer you/the renowned filmmaker makes you stare at this unassuming environment, the more you ask yourself, what is here? Why are they showing me this? Simply by paying attention and asking those questions, you are giving meaning to what you see and hear. Or the meaning is revealed to you, not sure which. You can play this game while sitting down or even while walking. It's kind of fun to watch where you are stepping without actually looking down at your feet. I do, however, recommend pausing the game long enough to look both ways when crossing the street. Personally, I don't have any rules for how long to stick with one shot, as it were. For me, it probably takes about a minute of contemplation for something to begin to emerge. But whatever that thing is surely bottomless, infinite. So there's no clear end point. But that's the case with all these games, really. They can't be won or even completed, only played. They are meant to get you out of your head. Once you're out, you can keep playing, or you can turn to other, more serious matters, this time with a perspective that extends well past the end of your own nose. Okay, time for game number 3. This is perhaps the simplest of the games, but it's also the most trippy. I guess what I should say is that it's the simplest game to play. It might be the most difficult one to explain and understand, but let's give it a shot. This game comes from the 3rd chapter of a book I referenced in episode 2 called The Wisdom of Insecurity by Alan Watts. If you read the chapter, or better yet, the whole book, you'll gain insight that makes the game even more fun to play. In this chapter, Watts is trying to get us to see words for what they are. Noises. Noises that point to or symbolize a thing or an idea. Within a language, we agree, by and large, on which noises point to which things. This is called convention. It's how things are done, and we agree to it. A convention, though, is merely a social convenience. Another example of this is money. Money gets us around the awkwardness and inconvenience of bartering, but it is absurd, according to Watts, to conflate money with real wealth, which of course we all do, because you can't eat it, or wear it, or live in it. Its value is dependent on there being things to buy. Words are very convenient, there's no doubt about it. It's much easier and faster to say the word I than to gesture towards yourself every time you want to say something. However, Watts points out that the word I immediately caused a sense of separateness to be born, and with it, a whole slew of problems which language and thought then had to grapple with. Another way in which words tend to misguide us is that they remain fixed, even while the things they represent are fluid and changing, undergoing processes of growth, death, decay, erosion, regeneration, even as the word stands still. So Watts reminds us that words are just sounds, or noises. They are useful, he says, only as long as we treat them the way we treat imaginary lines of latitude and longitude, which no one expects to actually exist upon the face of the earth. But no one treats words this way. We all operate in a world of words. Words may have started out as a way to communicate our experience, but somewhere along the line, we took them to be a suitable stand-in for reality, a shorthand, so to speak. We suppose that by naming something, we have successfully demystified it. And I guess that, in a sense, we have. One of the most striking illustrations from this chapter of the book is when Watts points out that you cannot truly define a real living thing by simply associating it with a noise or a word. All definitions are circular, he says, because they're just made up of other words. To bring this home, he says, when we say this, pointing with a finger, is a man, the thing to which we point is not man. To be clearer, we should have said, this is symbolized by the noise man. What then is this? We do not know. I don't know about you, but this blows my mind every time I read it, probably because I am forever reverting back to the assumption that words are real. When I read that passage, for a brief second, the imaginary lines of latitude and longitude disappear. So now that I've set it up, here's how to play the game. Wherever you are, look for the nearest naturally occurring thing, for example, a tree, and stare at it for a little while. Study it, perhaps even admire it. And then, when you feel ready, have the following conversation in your head. Yes, it's a conversation, so it involves two separate voices. And, pro tip, I find it immensely helpful to point, even if it's inconspicuous, at the thing. Okay, here goes. Person 1 says, "This is not a tree. This is symbolized by the noise, tree." Person 2 asks, "Okay, then what is it?" Person 1 replies, "I have no idea." That's one round. Then go on to the next thing. A blade of grass, a dandelion, a caterpillar. Each time, go through the incantation slowly, deliberately, only as fast as you can understand what you are saying. I say incantation because this game does have a magical quality, although I don't know if you're casting a spell or breaking one. We're already kind of living under the spell of words. Under the spell, words trick us into looking just past the real world. Living as we do in a world of words, we're inclined to superimpose our own abstractions onto reality. Because words enjoy this position of primacy in our minds, our search for meaning then is kind of backwards, according to Watts. Instead of wondering what the meaning of life is, we should realize that this, you can't see me, but I'm gesturing around wildly, is the meaning of the word life. That life does not have meaning, but is meaning. To illustrate this using something that's a little easier to see and talk about, he writes, "A tree by itself is meaningless, but is the meaning of the word tree." I like this as a sort of cool-down game. A dandelion by itself is meaningless, but is the meaning of the word dandelion. A caterpillar by itself is meaningless, but is the meaning of the word caterpillar. Are you having fun yet? I said earlier that I have both games and activities on standby for when I need to get out of my head. I think of this last one as more of an activity than a game. I suppose because it doesn't involve splitting your mind in two. If you think about it, in the first game, you must become a curious child of the future, even as you inhabit the present moment as a much older version of yourself. In the second game, you become a documentarian and a viewer at once. In the third game, you become the emphatic tree pointer and shoulder shrugger, while also playing the part of the incredulous straight man. In this activity, you don't need to be of two minds. Instead, you merely allow the mind of a poet, living or dead, to enter yours. There is one prerequisite, and that is, you must memorize a poem. The idea that memorizing a poem could be a worthwhile pursuit in an age of not really needing to remember anything seems to be bubbling up in various places. I was first inspired to memorize a poem last summer after listening to one of my favorite podcasts, Weird Studies, and I recently noticed that the New York Times has started a new series which walks the reader through memorizing a single poem over the course of 1 week. Actually, I remember listening to Krista Tippett's interview with Eugene Peterson on the marvelous On Being podcast a few years ago, in which he speaks beautifully about language and about the life-enriching effects of committing a poem to memory. He said that when he memorizes a poem, it's as if the poet's music gets inside his head, and then, as he goes about his day, it's like he's reading poetry without even realizing he's reading poetry, like when you have a song stuck in your head. Peterson, a retired minister, said that the Book of Psalms was his introduction to poetry, and he told a story in the interview that really stuck with me. During his time as a pastor, he went to visit a woman who was lonely. She said to him, "My life is limp, formless. I need something to give it definition." And then she showed him the needlepoint she was working on and said, "Like this hoop frame. I can stretch the cloth tight across it, and then everything starts to fit together." Then Peterson said, "I know just what you need," and came back a couple of days later with a copy of the Psalms. He said, "Just take one of these Psalms, stretch your mind around it, and see what happens." That image of cloth stretching neatly over a hoop frame is such a great metaphor for how it feels to recite a poem from memory, or by heart, as Phil Ford and J.F. Martell, hosts of the Weird Studies podcast, prefer to say. The scope of their conversation on this topic is really beyond what I'm going to be able to convey here, but as I mentioned, it is what finally inspired me to memorize a poem last summer. It's episode number 173 if you want to check it out, which I highly recommend. The episode is called By Heart, on memory, poetry, and form. In it, they talk about the mysterious role of the heart in memorization, of how it is more than just a cerebral activity, how we come to embody the poem or the song or the piece of music which we learn by heart. They talk about the idea that once we read a poem, it is with us forever. And in memorizing it, what we are actually doing is learning to go into our hearts, that our minds are learning to trust the process of going into our hearts to find our way through the poem, which, deep down, we already know. At the time that I heard this episode, I happened to be attempting to read Paterson, the epic poem by William Carlos Williams, so I decided to start there. No, I did not memorize the entire poem. It's basically a book. But I did memorize the first 2 pages, and I recited them under my breath countless times over the next week or 2. The first thing that happened when I did this was that I caught the meaning of the words in a way I had not upon my first reading. I saw their cleverness, their precision. When you are fumbling your way through a poem from memory, you recognize the choice that every word is. The phrasing that rolls off your tongue might not be the phrasing the poet has chosen, so you must be careful at each juncture. Parts of speech that you normally view as inconsequential and ultimately interchangeable now take center stage alongside every other word. Language is illuminated, which is to say, your mind is illuminated. What was dim and convoluted becomes pristine. After the initial act of trying to memorize the poem, I started trying it out in the wild, while driving, walking, falling asleep at night, times when I couldn't just grab the book to remind myself of what came next. Even in its imperfection, even though my recitation went back and forth between smooth sailing and whitewater rafting, the act of wrapping my mind around a poem was always calming, grounding, and vivifying. Anytime I started mentally going down a road that was unhelpful, I would say to myself, "Paterson lies in the valley, under the Passaic Falls," and so on. And whatever petty nonsense I was about to get into scurried off into the wings. When choosing a poem, I think it's important that you like it, but understanding it is not necessary. The only other important thing is that it should be a challenge. If you can memorize it in a few minutes and rattle it off without thinking about it, it won't really do the trick. Let it be something you can sink your teeth into, something you struggle with slightly, because that's part of the fun. Yes, fun. All of these games and activities are fun, but that doesn't mean they're easy. Depending on your state of mind, the prospect of engaging in one of them may seem rather unappealing. Sometimes we feel that we just can't step away from stirring our little pot of problems, even if we know deep down that we're not really getting anywhere. But it's good to have these games in your back pocket, just in case opportunity strikes. Next time you feel yourself getting bored or impatient or anxious, or maybe you're standing in line or sitting in a waiting room and you just don't want to pull your phone out for once. Next time that happens, you can look at your surroundings as if you're here from the future. Or you can fix your eyes on some humble object. Or you can try to separate the word from the thing. Or, if you've done some homework, you can recite a poem. I'll leave you with one final thought. The difficulty of making one's own mind a hospitable place to be is not a particularly modern challenge. We have more ways of evading the problem now, but the problem is not new. I'll end with an excerpt from a poem by John Donne, the English poet born in 1572. He wrote, "And seeing the snail, which everywhere doth roam, carrying his own house still is at home. Follow, for he is easy-paced, this snail. Be thine own palace, or the world's thy jail." Support for First Creatures comes from our listeners. Thank you to everyone who has signed up for monthly donations, including our newest supporters, Ben Burning, Bill Freeman, and Betsy and Ernie Gates. To learn more about First Creatures and to find out how you can support the podcast, visit firstcreatures.com. Thanks for listening.